Yo, right here at YouTube and all the subscribers. Thanks for joining me. My guest is Arthur R. Thompson. Arthur Thompson is the CEO of the John Birch Society. He is the author of International Merger by Foreign Entanglements. Let me just hold this book up for my viewers. Available at major bookstores, available online. Arthur, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Oh, my pleasure. Good to be here.
Arthur, I want to talk a little bit about the background of your book, which is about entangling alliances and how it's wrapping America as a sovereign nation and us as American citizens into this international web where we are surrendering aspects of our freedom over time and slowly. But I want to give us a little bit of the history of America's role in terms of its relations with foreign nations and what that was, the vision for that by our founding fathers, the founders of the Republic.
Sure. I hope I don't bore your viewers with too much history, but really it started with the wisdom of Thomas Jefferson, particularly George Washington and others, that said they did not want to get involved in entangling alliances with any part of the world. Period. Whether it was done militarily or economically or anything else. Now, the reason for that was that we could not be a free sovereign nation if we became entangled in these treaties and such that forced us into making the decision to go to war or not to go to war, to be able to manufacture certain items or export or import certain items, so on and so forth. And that remained the policy of the United States clear up to the election of 1912. And after the election of 1912, a number of different things were done to our Constitution that allowed the government to start getting involved in entangling alliances. The main thing they did, and one of the key ingredients that they knocked out of our original government was the Senate representing the states. In other words, they came in with the 16th and 17th Amendment. One was for the income tax, and the other was to change the election of senators from being appointed by the state governments, in other words, the state legislatures, to being elected by the people. And once the Senate stopped representing the states, now ostensibly they did, but in reality, that's not where they answered. They answered to the voter rather than the legislature or to the governor. Once that happened, things started to change drastically in the way of our international affairs in dealing with other countries, particularly in the way of trade and going to war and so on and so forth. They tried to get us involved in the League of Nations right after World War I. But the opposition within the Senate reflected the will of the people, which was, we don't want to get involved in something like that prevents us from being independent. Yes, in the name of peace, we would get together and everything would seem to be real nice, except for the fact that we would have lost that particular constitutional prerogative to declare or not to declare war. Once that started to wear down, by that I mean wear down the idea that the Senate had anything to do with the state governments. More and more, our government federally got involved in foreign policies that not only entangled our government in with other governments, but altered the Constitution in the process. And I don't want to get too involved into this, other than to say that most of these things alter the Constitution of the United States. For instance, you take a trade treaty. What that does, the way they're structured today, is it places that in the hands of an international commission, an international court, rather than the Congress. And the Constitution says that Congress will regulate trade with foreign nations. Well, with each additional treaty, what you find is that we have given up that power from Congress to a new entity. And this is continually growing over time. So that less and less Congress has anything to say with the regulation of international trade. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. And so we've been conditioned to believe that treaties supersede the Constitution. That is not true. It can't be the way it is. Excuse me.
Well, let me interject here a little bit.
Sure.
First of all, my understanding is that the original function of our Constitution and the original intent of our founding generation was to maintain amicable relations with foreign nations, but on the basis of American interest and mutual benefit, not at America's expense, not in any way to interfere with America's ability to determine its own nature and its own destiny. And that foreign trade was really a bilateral thing where we would enter into various trade agreements with specific foreign nations, that those treaties would have a specific timetable, and that they would be set up in such a way that they would benefit American labor, American industry, American manufacturing. And that this is a position, by the way, that's been very much embraced by our current president, Donald Trump. And it's kind of, in a way, a fallback to the original American conception of trade. Now, you accurately point out that there was a major change in the way we govern ourselves at the election of 1912, which brought in Woodrow Wilson, who was an open and avowed socialist. And that Wilson and that year changed a lot of things in terms of how we govern ourselves. The change of the U.S. Senate, no longer representing the states, but now representing the federal government itself. The income tax amendment, which was the first time that the individual and American businesses could have to deal with a direct taxation of their income at its source. And other measures that we can talk about, the Federal Reserve Act, that's a whole different subject for another day. But the point is that in the process, our American government gave portions of its constitutional responsibility to other agencies, many of them quasi-public or private or even international, in the case of the United Nations, which came about after World War II. And the result is that we are less free today, not only as a nation, but as individuals. When you have agencies and foreign powers controlling the nature of what we have in goods and services, the value of our currency, the power to influence our culture in a way that is not just casual on an open market, but is direct, because they actually have lawmaking powers now and have since 1912.
Well, that's true. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that usually the title on any international agreement, treaty, agreement, pact, whatever word you want to put to it, the title on it is usually something to sell the American people on the idea that we need it. And almost always has almost nothing to do with the structure within the treaty. For instance, these new free trade treaties, everybody's for trade, everybody's for free trade. But what they don't understand is that's a trap. If you argue these treaties and pacts and agreements on the idea of free trade, you've already lost, because it has virtually nothing to do with free trade. What it is doing is regionalizing our economy and placing the economy of the American people into the hands of an international consortium with each new treaty. It's not whether or not we get a fair deal, a good deal, something for more jobs and more industry. That, again, is a trap if you debate these things on that level. For instance, let's say we're out of jobs. Let's say we've got a poor economy. We can always recover from that if we remain a free country. But if we lose our independence, we can't recover from that. And that's what's really going on within all of these things, even military pacts like NATO and other things. Every pact that we've entered into since the end of World War II subjugates ourselves to the United Nations. Somewhere in that agreement, whether it's right at the beginning or deep into its body, is that subjugation to the United Nations. Sometimes it's not there because it may be a treaty added on to another treaty. And if you go back to the original treaty from which this thing sprang, that subjugation will be in there. In NAFTA, it was very, very, very subtle. But NAFTA, for instance, has virtually nothing to do with jobs in the economy. What it's got to do, and it serves as the platform for the North American Union to merge the United States, Canada, and Mexico into one body. And if you read the pronouncements of the individuals who put this forward, who supported it at the onset, and the leaders of the other countries, Canada and Mexico, they're very open about the fact of what they call, first of all, economic integration. It's not trade, it's economic integration. And if we integrate our economy with theirs, we're in a lot of trouble.
First of all, this goes a long way to explain.
Mexico is a socialist country, if whether people realize it or not. It has been since 1914, but yes, most Americans are not aware of that. They've had communists in their government ever since then. And so all of this is designed to change and alter our economy and merge it with these other countries, whether it's Canada or Mexico or what other group of countries in any particular pact, like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Partnership, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Mexico was communist before the Soviet Union. It was back right. The Mexican Revolution. All right, my guest is Arthur R. Thompson. The book is International Merger by Foreign Entanglements. Arthur, I want to talk a little bit about international trade agreements themselves as they're structured. This may seem a little elementary, but I mean, a trade agreement is not something that's a permanent structure, or is it? I mean, isn't it something that has a sunset clauses? It has like an expiration date. You know, when this country enters into a trade agreement with any foreign nation, that, you know, situations, economies, political situations, they change. And thus a treaty can and ought to be changed or altered or abolished depending on the situation. Isn't that true?
That's generally true. The further along we get in the history of trade agreements, the less that's true. But it is the way it's supposed to be structured. Yes.
Now I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say that the biggest problem you have with that sunset clause, whatever name you want to put on it, today is that it's a matter of years rather than immediately. In other words, you've got to go through a systematic timeline structure of being able to withdraw that takes years to withdraw. In other words, you have to give notification, then you got to jump through this hoop and another hoop and so on and so forth until for years down the road, you're not really out of it.
Kind of makes me think of in Great Britain, the Brexit thing. I mean, I just saw an article saying that it's going to take them, I think it was 50 years before they get out of that thing. But by that point, they'll have already re-entangled themselves, and people, I guess the establishment hopes that everyone's going to forget about it. But, I think it was after World War II as part of the Bretton Woods Conference, by which John Maynard Keynes was the British economist. America was represented by Harry Dexter White, who was a Soviet agent, and where they came up with the three economic pillars of the new world moving forward in the post-World War II period: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. And in the case of the World Trade Organization, that is what led to, that was ratified in 1993 by Bill, signed into law by Bill Clinton, supported by former President George H.W. Bush. Both Republican and Democrat establishment figures promoted this, and what that did was essentially transfer American sovereign ability based on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which says that Congress shall regulate tariffs and trade, to this world organization, this WTO, which can now make determination with regard to American corporations and trading with foreign nations. They can penalize the United States if they don't observe certain modicums of trade. And what that is a serious breach of American sovereignty, a move toward very much what we've talked about here, this new world order economically. And it's utterly unconstitutional because the Constitution says Congress shall make those decisions. Instead, trade decisions are made by this body of faceless bureaucrats, many of whom are not American, but even if they are, they're not elected. They don't have the legal authority under the Constitution to exercise those decisions.
Well, that's true. It's true, and it's increasingly true with each additional trade treaty or agreement. And they're not talking about these things being treaties actually anymore. They talk about them being agreements. And the reason they're doing this is because that entails the House of Representatives as well as the Senate, because it says that Congress shall regulate tariffs and trade. Now, they can come back later on and say, wait a minute, this pact is illegal because it violates the Constitution, but they can't say that if the House votes on it. And yet most House members don't even realize what they're doing when they're voting on these agreements, that they're actually abrogating their responsibility and power under the Constitution of the United States, thereby effectively amending the Constitution without the amendment process being in place. And this is becoming a serious problem, but it is rarely ever discussed on other programs other than those like you have here today. But you never hear about it on Fox. You never ever hear about it on CNN or anything else. It's all jobs and it's all about the economy. They never talk about the sovereignty aspects of it and how it is destroying the Constitution of the United States.
And I think that if one actually takes a look and takes a dive into the NAFTA agreement, they will see, Arthur, that you're absolutely right. This is very little to do with trade. It has everything to do with merging the three economies of North America and forming a regional entity, very much like the European Union has done in Europe. And yeah.
In fact, Henry Kissinger in the Los Angeles Times said that this was the framework of a new international order and the best opportunity to build a new world order since the end of the Cold War. So he understood what NAFTA was and was, of course, very supportive of it. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, just recently went down through these three entities in a speech that he gave to CFR members, a paper actually that he wrote, saying that the World Trade Organization and the IMF and all the rest of them were weakened, are being weakened because of the new generation of people in the United States that are more populist, that have they've lost support for the United Nations and other things like that. And it was a paper designed to spur the Council on Foreign Relations members to work harder towards preserving and then increasing these foreign entanglements through all these various entities, the three that you cited, as well as any new trade agreements that are on the table right now. And keep in mind too that the negotiator that Trump has, Lighthizer, is a decades old member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Council on Foreign Relations believes and promotes and supports, pushes, whatever word you want to use, for a one world government. That is their purpose. That is their prime purpose. That's their mission. And anybody can't be a member of that for over 25 years unless he believes in that. And yet here's a guy, Lighthizer, who is negotiating or renegotiating the NAFTA agreement. I'm not going to hold my breath that we're going to find anything come out of this NAFTA agreement that's going to be good for the Constitution and the American people.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying about the CFR is well known, well documented. It's a very powerful foreign policy think tank that advocates, as you say, world order, and has done so right since its inception, right after World War I, when there was an attempt to preserve the march toward world order. That was what World War I was all about. And I want to talk a little bit about this emergence of a world order. Up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, it seems to me that the agenda was convergence, that the Soviets would move a little more to the right, the United States would move to the left, until eventually the two would converge. And this was a concept that was openly talked about by none other than President Franklin Roosevelt. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, which I don't think the establishment expected, and the emergence of more freedom-oriented movements, that's when it seems to me you had the NAFTA agreement and the World Trade Organization, and that the concept of convergence was replaced with this idea of regional economic entities that would eventually become quasi-political, like the North American entity, like the European Union. Probably there's one in Asia and Africa. And the idea being that eventually the world would be divided up into these spheres of influence, these where the nation state would continue, at least in appearance. You know, they would retain a certain cultural entity, sort of like a football team. You know, it's sort of like, oh, we're for these guys. But the fact of the matter is that genuine governance would have been transferred to these unelected bureaucracies, and that ultimately they would all work together. The whole thing is very similar to not so much the communist model, but the Nazi socialist model, where the Nazi vision was that Europe would be one region, the Far East would under Japan would be another region, you know, and likewise. And I think that's what we're seeing happening here.
Well, that is all outlined in George Orwell's volume 1984, the very, very popular international bestseller, where the world would be divided into three zones, ruled primarily out of China, United States, and Russia. And that has not changed, that basic idea of regionalizing the world, but being ruled by one inner party, as it was put in the book 1984. That these people really cooperate with one another, even though they may war on one another, simply to do the things that they do to get the people that they rule to support whatever they're doing in the name of the war effort. Now, there's one thing that I would interject about what you just related. And that is that these people were not really caught off guard by the so-called collapse of communism. Now, there are a couple of things entering into that, why I say that. First of all, it was a book by Anatoly Golitsyn. I can't remember the title of it right now. Mm-hmm. He worked in the planning department of the KGB. He defected to the United States, and 5 years before the wall came down in Berlin, he said that's what's going to happen. They're going to make it appear as though communism has gone away. They're going to replace all the top leaders of these communist satellites with the second or third layer of the communist apparatus in those states, names unfamiliar to Americans, which is exactly what happened in every country. He said these are the people who are going to replace the ones that are going to be put in power. And 5 years before it happened, he put it in his book. And I went on a fact-finding tour of Europe, and primarily Germany, at when the wall came down. I was in Berlin when the wall was coming down. Yeah, I was able to interview a lot of people inside the West German government, even a few East German communists, the man on the street, the civil servant, publishers, professors, you name it, and got a real sense of what was going on. And just to give you an idea, the man who was in charge of public relations for what became the EU, I had an interview with him, a guy by the name of Piplot. Mm-hmm. And he was very arrogant about what was going to happen. He said, as a result of all of this, we're going to combine the United Europe into an entity that's going to be bigger than the United States. And once we do that, we will force you into this alliance with us as part of this new country, whether you like it or not, kicking and screaming. Now, that was what was in the minds of all these people at the time. And if you go back and look at a lot of the inner workings and the inner papers of organizations like Brookings and the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, et cetera, who support this sort of thing, they weren't really caught off guard at all. It was a very well master plan, and it played out very well. You know, one of the things that the media never pointed out to the American people was there wasn't a single communist in all the communist apparatus of Russia and its Eastern European satellites, Central European satellites, not one communist walked out of the government the next day after communism collapsed and said, well, I guess I'm out of work. I've got to find something else to do. They all stayed in government. Even today, there are many of these people in the government. And some of these people, like in Hungary and particularly in Poland, they're trying to get rid of these communists in their government. They've never left, particularly judges. And the European Union has told Poland, for instance, that if you try to get rid of these people out of the government, we are going to impose sanctions on you. And all the Poles are trying to do is to get rid of all these communists. The EU is not allowing them to do so. So it was a very masterful plan, very well put together. It had been in the works for a long time, and it had been in the works because of something that was going on in the United States. And what was happening in the United States was this. The American people were beginning to wake up. There became an increasing opposition to what was happening, not just with communism, but the elite organizations at the top who were really controlling communism, all the while looking as though they were business barons and so on and so forth. People who you would never think would be in support of a communist government. But the growing anti-communist movement in the United States was hurting their timetable in the United States. Two things particularly hurt them badly. One was the decrease of support for the United Nations. For instance, when the John Birch Society started our program to get us out of the UN, 30% of the American people were opposed to the United Nations. By the 1980s, almost 80% of the American people were opposed to the United Nations. Another thing that was of paramount importance in the United States was the program to nationalize our police. No totalitarian state can exist without a national police force. We have local police. We're the only country in the world that has truly a local police that answers to the mayor and the city council and the local voters. All the other countries in the world have a system of a national control, whether it's direct control or indirect control. And the Support Your Local Police program by the United States hurt their timetable so badly that they were fearful that the whole thing would collapse, because all of these things have to be moved forward in echelon movements. In other words, one part of their agenda moves forward here, another part of their agenda moves forward there, but they pretty much all have to do so in a united front. If any of those things break down, they're in serious trouble. So as a result of that, they missed their initial timetable for taking over the United States. The initial timetable was 1976. They wanted the 200th anniversary of the War of Independence to be their beginning of a Soviet United States. We cost them that date. We set them back a minimum of 50 years. And we have set them back time after time in their timetables for takeover in the 80s, the 90s, with the idea of the TPP, that date they missed, with the idea of a free trade zone of Americas, which was all the American countries, 34, except for Cuba, into a European Union style of government under George W. Bush. They missed that timetable of 2005. And so they keep missing these timetables because we keep battling them, pushing them back, interrupting their agenda. And we did so much in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. They finally had, in the 80s, plan to collapse communism on the face of it without really changing anything. Everything was still there, just a new face, a new name. And most of the citizens of Eastern Europe pretty much understand that communism didn't go away. It's just got a new name and a new face.
Well, it's had a setback, and but yet when you look at somebody like Putin, he was definitely KGB communist. So, that you could take a look at some of the leadership in some of the other former Soviet countries, and you see a lot of communists. Although you're quite right in that Poland and Hungary and other nations in that region, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, there's a big movement toward freedom. There is a freedom-oriented leadership that is starting to emerge, and that they're taking a lot of flack from the EU and the left-leaning, internationalist-oriented, globalist establishment. But yet, we take a look around the world and we do see the growth of genuine awareness of the importance of the nation state, nationalism in the best sense and in the American sense, in that you have a nation state that's sovereign, that has a constitutional system, that operates on the principle of limited government, and that has a Judeo-Christian moral and ethical culture. And that is emerging around the world as well, and that it is putting back their plans. I think the election of Donald Trump is a great example of that in the United States, a very significant example to me. Even the fact that he might have to work with the establishment, nevertheless, he's a revolutionary figure in the best sense.
Well, that's why they're attacking him so much.
That's right, and they're throwing everything but the kitchen sink at him, and it's they can't find it. They have people all over the world trying to find out something about Trump. It's unbelievable, the level of war against Trump. I mean, I pray for President Trump every day when I take a look at some of the forces that he's up against. But he's part of an international movement of citizens who are recognizing the importance of sovereignty, that is a progressive idea in the real meaning of the word. The British Brexit movement has everything to do with this. So we have a great awareness. It makes me feel optimistic, makes me feel hopeful, even with a very sober understanding of the forces that we're up against. I certainly admire the work of the John Birch Society all these years out there soldiering along in terms of bringing up awareness amongst the citizenry of the importance of our constitutional system and the very nature and the sinister nature of these forces that oppose it and that want to reduce our rights as individuals and our national rights by merging them into this world order, whatever you want to call it, that is controlled by unelected internationalists who think they know better for the future than we as citizens know. But anyways, Arthur, we're reaching toward the end of the interview. So again, I want you to, and again, by the way, this is the book. Let me get it right there. International Merger by Foreign Entanglements. My guest is Arthur Thompson. He's the author. Arthur, what do you see going forward in terms of, I want to leave our listeners with some takeaways in terms of what they can do to help further the advancement of our national sovereignty and what they can get involved with.
Well, first of all, they need to inform themselves on any subject they wish to discuss, but they need to reach out to their friends and family and peers, fellow employees, and people in the local community who really are running the community, leaders in the Boy Scouts, in the Kiwanis, on the city council, and that sort of thing, and inform them of what's going on. But it has to be done in a concerted manner. I suggest that your viewers go to jbs.org, jbs.org. There they will find a number of issues that they can involve themselves in and do it in concert with other people, with some additional background to what's being discussed in the issue of the day to give a better understanding of what is really going on. But more importantly, who is bringing these things about? You can win the argument, but if you've got an organization out there that's constantly working to bring about a totalitarian system in the United States and link arms with communist countries, that's a problem, and they have to be exposed as to who are the individuals doing that. I took the oath 5 times, 4 times in uniform and once on my city council, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, to protect it from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, they teach us who the foreign enemies are, but nobody seems to want to tell us who the domestic enemies of the Constitution are. Well, the John Birch Society does. We name names, and that's what gets us into a lot of trouble. Sometimes it gets us into trouble because they don't want to be exposed. Other times it gets us into trouble because nobody wants to lose a hero. And regrettably, some of these people pose as conservatives. And so they need to be called out and answerable for their actions. So go to jbs.org. Another thing that they can do is to sign up for the top daily headlines at thenewamerican.com. And every day they'll get 5 articles written by a series of authors on the issues of the day that give a lot of background information that is not coming through the main fake news, if you will.
Yeah.
So thenewamerican.com is another place that you can keep abreast every day of what's going on in print, online, or you can go to the hard copy as far as that goes.
No, I would urge viewers to get the online New American. I get it, and I really look to it. It's a great and informative email that I look for and look forward to getting and read the articles. So, Arthur, I want to thank you again for joining me this afternoon. It's been very interesting. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, it's my pleasure as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, so that does things for today. I shall return, God willing, tomorrow, 12 noon live here at Facebook and at YouTube. Have a good day.